Hello, if you were to ask an average American to describe the three best presidents their country has ever had, without a doubt, the name of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or simply JFK, would appear in the response. This is because he is truly considered one of the greatest politicians the country has ever had. As president, he served between 1961 and 1963. During his brief tenure as the 35th President of the United States, he resolved the issue of Russian missiles in Cuba, worked towards ending segregation in schools and public facilities, and advocated for the voting rights of Black Americans. Additionally, his negotiations with the then-Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev prevented the two countries from reaching extremes during the Cold War. On November 22, 1963, the last day of his life, Kennedy was in Dallas, Texas, as part of a planned trip to boost his popularity among Southern voters before the 1964 presidential elections. He had departed from Fort Worth, and during the journey, the motorcade had to make several stops so the president could greet people at the intersection of Houston and Elm Streets. The motorcade made a 120-degree left turn, which required the limousine to slow down. Kennedy was in a convertible car, a 1961 Lincoln Continental, accompanied by his wife Jacqueline, Texas Governor John Bowdoin Connolly Jr. and his wife Nellie, Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman, and driver William Greer. As the journey continued, the unexpected occurred. President Kennedy was fatally shot by a gunshot whose origin or perpetrator was initially unknown. Immediately, the Secret Service, security agents, and the FBI began hunting for the shooter. On the same day, the FBI managed to capture the alleged shooter, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald, an employee at a book depository in Dallas. Oswald was held in custody for 2 days, undergoing relentless interrogation and refusing to speak about any circumstances. On the 24th, 2 days after the assassination, he was being transferred to a jail when the group was surprised by a man identified at the time as Jack Ruby, a 57-year-old who sealed Oswald's fate at that moment. Ruby was arrested and convicted in 1964 with the death penalty. However, before he could finish counting his days, he fell victim to lung cancer, passing away in January 1967. Ruby's motives for the murder remained unclear, with conspiracy theories linking him to the mafia and groups associated with President John Kennedy's assassination. After his arrest, Ruby claimed to have acted alone with the purpose of avenging Kennedy's death and preventing his wife from being compelled to testify at Oswald's trial. The assassination of John Kennedy has become a subject of numerous conspiracy theories over the decades. However, in a statement made in December 2022, the CIA, the principal intelligence agency of the United States, categorically stated that it had never had any interaction with Lee Oswald, the alleged assassin of Kennedy, and had not withheld any information from investigators. According to some news outlets, experts eagerly awaited the latest release of documents, finally cleared by the Biden administration in 2022, hoping they would shed more light on Oswald's activities in Mexico City. Oswald had been there in October 1963, where he met with a KGB officer, the intelligence agency of the Soviet Union. However, the CIA stated that all the information it possessed about Oswald's trip to Mexico had already been disclosed previously, asserting that the release of the 2022 files contained no new information on this matter. The Mary Farrell Foundation, a nonprofit organization advocating for government transparency, contested this claim, alleging that the CIA was withholding information about Oswald's time in Mexico. According to the foundation, some records made by the CIA were never added to the archives and thus were not included in the recently released batch of documents. On the same day Kennedy was assassinated, one of the United States' biggest adversaries, former Cuban President Fidel Castro, was at Veradero Beach in Cuba, having lunch with a French journalist named Jean Daniel. The two were at Fidel's retreat when the phone rang with the shocking news of an assassination attempt against John Kennedy. The news reverberated swiftly. Castro and Daniel, who had extensively discussed Kennedy, were surprised by the news. The Cuban leader even remarked to the journalist about his satisfaction with the growing camaraderie between JFK and Nikita Khrushchev, the then leader of the Soviet Union. He believed the two were working together to end the Cold War. In a conversation, Castro confided in Daniel, saying, "I have the impression in all my conversations with Khrushchev that Kennedy is a man with whom one can have a frank dialogue. Castro expressed his desire to collaborate with Kennedy once the president secured a second term. However, despite Castro's respect for Kennedy, it seemed evident that the CIA had a very different opinion about the president. Many theories about the motive behind the crime abound, involving not only Kennedy's relationship with Russia, which the CIA was monitoring, but also conspiracy theories, including mafia involvement. So let's first understand what was said about mafia involvement but also another conspiracy theory. In 1964, the Warren Commission was formed to clarify the assassination of President John Kennedy. It concluded that Lee Oswald acted alone, firing 2 fatal shots at 12:30. However, a subsequent investigation conducted in 1976 by the United States House of Representatives Investigative Committee suggested that Oswald was not acting alone and that there were 2 more shooters involved. The first shooter was positioned on the 2nd floor of the Deltex building, while Oswald was on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. The third shooter was positioned in a grassy area. The first shot hit Kennedy from the back, pierced through his chest, and lodged in his thigh. The following 2 shots were fired with only a split-second interval. The third shot hit Kennedy in the back of the head, exiting and hitting the windshield. A fragment of this bullet also struck Connally in the right wrist. The fourth shot, coming from the grassy area, hit Kennedy in the face, at the same spot where the third shot had exited. Kennedy was taken to the hospital alive but was declared dead at 13:33. Oswald, identified by witnesses, was pursued and arrested at 13:50. Although the official version of the crime is that of the Warren Commission, the investigative committee's report suggested that the assassination was the result of a conspiracy involving organized crime. What left investigators astonished and hopeless at the time was the fact that Oswald was also so visibly and carelessly assassinated by the executor. This happened at the Dallas Police Headquarters during his transfer to a maximum security prison, in front of television cameras and transporting officers. From this, the theory emerged that the mafia was responsible for this apparent cleanup operation. Well, turning back to Fidel Castro, when the news confirmed that Kennedy was dead, the former Cuban president, quite solemnly, told the French journalist that everything was going to change, and indeed it did. Firstly, because the hopes of negotiations between the United States and Russia died with John Kennedy. So much so that the Cold War lasted nearly 30 more years. On March 13, 1962, General Lyman Lemnitzer, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, presented a bold plan to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, a trusted man of President John Kennedy. Lemnitzer, like many others in the upper echelons of the military and American intelligence, had a burning desire to invade Cuba. However, to justify such action, a convincing motive would be necessary. That's when Lemnitzer revealed to McNamara Operation Northwoods, a plan that reflected the type of mindset that surrounded Kennedy at that time. Operation Northwoods was a false flag operation, an orchestrated event where a fictitious hostile action is used to justify an offensive response. Lemnitzer's plan was to attack U.S. military bases themselves and attribute the blame to the Cubans. During the resulting chaos from bullets and bombs, U.S. intelligence propagandists would spread rumors over the radio about a brutal attack on innocent American citizens. To lend more credibility to the operation, they would hire Cubans sympathetic to the United States to approach the attack sites wearing Cuban military uniforms. These men would then be captured, reinforcing the narrative that the Cubans were responsible for the attacks. Simple as that, and the CIA had all this power. Ah, and they had it. General Lemnitzer outlined a scenario of chaos and destruction: fires, burning aircraft, bombed facilities, attacked ships, and even funerals for fictitious victims would be staged. He anticipated casualty lists published in major newspapers accompanied by tragic stories to garner the necessary popular support for an invasion of Cuba. In the fourth part of his proposal, Lemnitzer suggested the creation of a communist terror campaign in Cuba that would extend to Miami, other Florida cities, and even to Washington itself. He foresaw injuries to innocent people that would be widely publicized, plastic bombs exploding in strategically chosen locations, and the inevitable outrage of American citizens who would support action against the communist terrorists. As absurd as it may seem, such subversive tactics were not uncommon during the Cold War. Lemnitzer claimed that all the chiefs of staff supported the plan and that the CIA was ready to implement it. They believed it was necessary to stop the communists at any cost, which partially explains why the CIA committed or encouraged human rights violations worldwide during the Cold War. When Kennedy took office, he entered a tense political environment. To fully understand the conspiracy theories surrounding the assassination of John Kennedy, it is crucial to recognize the extent to which some individuals in the U.S. military and intelligence were willing to go. Kennedy rejected Operation Northwoods, stating that he could not foresee any event in the near future that justified or made desirable a U.S. military offensive action in Cuba. This decision is well documented among CIA archives. According to the conspiracy theory, John Kennedy was isolated within his own government. He had already lost the support of many of his advisors after the Bay of Pigs incident in 1961, when the CIA secretly sent 1,400 trained Cuban exiles to invade Cuba. As a significantly younger president, Kennedy had a different vision of how politics should be conducted. The plan to invade Cuba had been drawn up during the Eisenhower administration before Kennedy took office. Even though Kennedy rejected similar plans during his term, he was still expected to follow orders. It all began when Fidel Castro's forces overthrew Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959. The CIA now wanted to overthrow Castro, as it had done clandestinely and successfully with leaders in Iran and Guatemala, with many assassinations along the way. Cuban exiles were trained by the United States in guerrilla training camps in Guatemala, and American involvement was supposed to be kept secret, which did not happen. The result was a total disaster. Castro's troops won and captured many of the exiles. Kennedy later told friends that the Bay of Pigs was a trap. He had a notable distrust of many of the older men advising him, including Allen Dulles, the CIA director. Dulles, in memoirs discovered after his death, admitted that the original plan had always been to pressure Kennedy to send troops instead of allowing the operation to fail. However, Kennedy chose a different approach. He provided Cuba with $53 million in baby food and medicine in exchange for the prisoners Castro had captured. This decision resulted in total embarrassment for the United States. Despite approving plans to assassinate Castro, Kennedy had to continue resisting pressure from hawks in his government who insisted on invading Cuba. U.S. involvement in Vietnam was a significant issue during Kennedy's presidency. In 1954, Vice President Richard Nixon expressed the United States' willingness to take on the risk in Vietnam if the French withdrew. The CIA subsequently supported French forces in Saigon, conducting paramilitary campaigns against the Communists. In 1961, John Kennedy agreed to send 500 Special Forces troops and military advisors to support the pro-Western government of South Vietnam. A year later, around 11,000 American military advisors were working in South Vietnam. However, Kennedy began to rethink his approach to Vietnam. He was under pressure to send actual combat troops but was against sending units capable of independent combat. The Pentagon Papers, released in 1971, revealed secret actions by the Department of Defense in Southeast Asia until 1968, including secret campaigns in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia that resulted in many civilian deaths. Conspiracy theorists believe that the out-of-control CIA would likely have been reined in if John Kennedy had not been removed. These are the main points linking the CIA to Kennedy's assassination. There are also other conspiracy points, as well as those that had to be accepted due to pressure from the CIA itself, which, of course, never admitted or will admit any involvement. From what you've seen so far, what would you say about CIA involvement in the Kennedy case? Well, thank you, and see you next time. Goodbye.